There is a name missing from the official record of Disneyland's creation. Not just missing, but erased. A man so vital to its inception, without him, it's likely theme parks as we know them would have never gotten off the ground. This raises the question, how could someone so important be so rarely spoken of? Well, as you're about to see, this individual did some less than conventional things in order to bring Walt's dream to life, the sort of things a company like Disney would rather you attribute to magic. This is the story of the other creator of Disneyland, C.V. Wood. In 1920, C.V. Wood was born in the town of Waynoka, Oklahoma, where his father worked for the Santa Fe Railroad. As a young boy, he developed a great affinity for westerns, learning to twirl a lariat so well it would one day land him a scholarship. Not only did Wood demonstrate a knack for showmanship from a young age, he was also great with people. When his family moved to Amarillo, Texas, Wood became fast friends with the neighbor boys, impressing them with his lariat tricks. This group of friends, which came to be known as the Bombers, would end up working for Wood out in California on the Disneyland project. Not taking school very seriously, Wood partied his way through college until money dried up and he had no choice but to get a job. It's the spring of 1941 and war armament is ramping up. Consolidated Aircraft is in need of qualified riveters. C.V. Wood, who has no background in riveting, shows up to the interview. His resume states he has been going to the University of Oklahoma pursuing an engineering degree. This was true, only in reality, according to research conducted by Todd for his book 3 Years in Wonderland, Wood left college without a degree of any kind. As the interview commenced, something told Wood not to correct the interviewers, blinded by the Texas charm, when they took a look at the resume and assumed he had in fact graduated with that engineering degree. Entering the room applying for an hourly riveter position, the 20-year-old CV would leave the room a salaried aircraft engineer in Consolidated's inspections department. Nobody ever bothered to check up on that degree. Some would call this the scam of the century. While not entirely qualified for his position at Consolidated, Wood was a hard worker. He quickly rose the ranks, hired many of his childhood friends, and soon the Bombers from Amarillo were in charge of building actual bombers, with Wood becoming chief industrial engineer on the construction of the B-24 Liberator bomber. The next chapter of Wood's life began when he joined the Stanford Research Institute in June of 1950. C.V. Wood led a small Los Angeles office for SRI, where himself and economist Buzz Price conducted research for various organizations. In June of 1953, Buzz Price received a call from Walt Disney's office inquiring about a place to put a highly themed amusement park. A meeting was scheduled with Walt where Price could propose a site location report and a study focused on how feasible Walt's silly-sounding idea really was. It was at this meeting Walt Disney would meet the fast-talking Texan C.V. Wood. The team examined 71 sites for Disneyland. After several botched land acquisition attempts, the plot in Anaheim along the Santa Ana Freeway expansion was chosen. It was on CV to close the deal and get all the individual landowners to option their land to Disney. An associate of CV would later say, quote, "He was young and charismatic, and he could charm farmers out of their orange groves with his Texas talk. I don't know, and I don't even want to know, some of the ways borders were changed and people were persuaded to sell their land to Disney." Wood pulled out every stop to get these contracts signed. One owner wanted the right to move their whole house. Another wanted palm trees on their property to be preserved there. CV penciled in any ridiculous demands the owners had right onto the contracts, whatever it took to get them to sell their orange groves to Disney. The official deal between all the landowners is that they'd be getting the same fair price per acre. What they didn't know is CV was sweetening the deal for those still on the fence by paying them many thousands extra for worthless structures on their property Disney was going to demolish anyways. Finally, thanks to CV, something went Disney's way. A land acquisition expected to cost $6,200 per acre ended up only costing $4,600 per acre thanks to the magic man, C.V. Wood. Walt's brother Roy, the financial end of the Walt Disney Company, was quite impressed with this display from CV. His knack for business, his connections, his social ability all made CV a top contender to manage the construction of Disneyland alongside Walt and Roy. Meeting with CV in April of 1954, CV made his pitch to Roy. Quote, "I can promote it, I can get the money for it, I can build it, and I can manage it." End quote. The creation of Disneyland Incorporated would soon be announced in papers across the country, with CV Wood becoming the first Disney Parks employee named Executive Vice President and General Manager of Disneyland. When CV stopped by Walt's office to celebrate, Walt said something very interesting. Being vice president, quote, "doesn't leave much room for advancement." CV had a lot to prove. It was time to get to work. As soon as he got the news, CV quickly began building out a team to handle the monumental challenge of creating this theme park, a type of theme park which had never been attempted before. He hired people from SRI to run the books, he brought in his friends from Amarillo, the Bombers, he also got to work recruiting talent that Walt was in desperate need of. While Walt had great artists turned Imagineers from the studio who could create amazing concept art, Walt also needed people with the technical know-how to tackle some very specialized tasks, like building a river in this Southern California dirt patch. CV knew just the guy, Admiral Joe Fowler, who Walt grew quite close with. Fowler insisted they build a dry dock to service the steamship, which Walt lovingly referred to as Fowler's Ditch. Today, it's still there, and it's known as Fowler's Harbor. CV also introduced Walt to a man he knew from his time building aircraft, an expert in human relations, Van France. Van France would go on to develop Disneyland's world-renowned training program used by the company to this day. In addition to bringing in the talent that made the Disney parks what we know them as now, CV would also contribute to the financial health of the project. 9 months away from opening, and little more than dirt to show for it, Walt was very stressed. The money they had secured through ABC television wasn't going to be enough to fund the project, and money was quickly running out. With Walt having failed to attract a number of sponsors through direct correspondence, it became the vice president's job to save the fledgling project. In another Magic Man type maneuver, CV signed Swift Restaurants into a $110,000 per year lease. He also brought on the Santa Fe Railroad his father worked for, PepsiCo, Richfield Oil, Upjohn Pharmacy, Sunnyview Farms, Yale and Town Locks, the National Lead Company, Monsanto, TWA, Kaiser Aluminum, and more. For tenants renting space on Main Street, CV required first and last years to be paid up front on the lease agreement, then allowing Disney to go to the bank and borrow against the middle years, raising even more money for a project rapidly ballooning in costs. As construction continued on Disneyland Park, an administration building was assembled on site for Walt and Wood. The building was comprised of 2 retired farmhouses that sat on the property, which were placed together in Tomorrowland. Downstairs, Walt had a bedroom to work in, as well as a bedroom to sleep. The Imagineers took up the rest of the bottom floor. Upstairs was the aircraft team, that being CV, his bombers, as well as legal and accountants. This was the business end of Disneyland Inc. There was always tension between upstairs and downstairs, CV and Walt. Walt needed someone like CV in order to make Disneyland a reality, but that doesn't mean Walt liked that he needed him. CV had a sense of humor that was much more colorful than Walt's, and ultimately Walt could sense that CV was about furthering the interests of CV, whereas Walt's trusted team of creatives was concerned with the integrity of the product that they were creating. This divide between creative and business, a physical divide in Disneyland's first administration building, was difficult for CV Wood because he felt he was creative. While precluded from expressing any of that creativity in projects already dominated by Walt's people, through the sponsorship deals that he secured, CV was able to employ some of his own creative flair. One particularly odd sponsor CV was able to sign was the Hollywood Maxwell Brazier Company. This newspaper clipping features CV front and center with the president of the Brazier Company, where CV Wood is credited with helping plan the displays, taking guests through the history of outerwear from the 19th century to modern day. In the spring of 1955, Disneyland started to half resemble the famous Herb Ryman drawing produced back in 1953. As they inched closer to the July 17th deadline, though, tempers began to flare. Exacerbated by the wettest spring in 20 years, it was clear to most Disney either wouldn't make Walt's hard deadline or would barely make it and be missing several attractions. Walt and CV butted heads as the deadline approached. Walt was being unreasonable in CV's eyes, where it seemed money, time, and labor was being wasted on the most ridiculous things. For example, Wood suggested for Main Street they use plastic railing on the top of the buildings. It's so high up, who would notice? Walt refused and insisted on genuine wrought iron for Main Street's roofline. Over at the railroad, workers laying ballast were ordered by Walt to pick all of it up and have it recrushed. It wasn't exactly the 5/8 scale that Walt had wanted. Through Walt and CV, we could get a glimpse into that timeless, creative vision versus realist battle that persists in any major creative endeavor. The difference between the Disney of then and the Disney of now is back then, it was the creative temperament that was winning out over the practical business concerns. Not only was Walt causing strife for CV, so were the overworked laborers. Plumber strikes and battling unions worsened the rate of progress at the park and increased construction expense. Not only were Walt and CV fighting, Walt and Roy were fighting as well. Roy knew what it would mean for Walt Disney Productions if Disneyland failed. They were all in on this pipe dream, which had inflated in cost fivefold. Walt, who was his own greatest critic, was well aware of the gravity of the situation. Walt was described by his wife Lillian as having been on the verge of breakdown during this race against time. As summer loomed, CV turned his attention towards the parking lot, one of the last pieces of infrastructure that needed to begin construction. There is an infamous CV-related story detailed in the book 3 Years in Wonderland, a story of arson committed in the final days of Disneyland's construction. Tasked with building a parking lot large enough for Disneyland, its vice president faced a roadblock with getting such a parking lot built. You see, since all the resources thus far had gone into building the park itself, the space set aside for parking was still littered with farmhouses, chicken coops, and other structures Disney had acquired the year prior. All of these needed to be removed promptly so that they could pave the lot. A construction crewman had a fun idea to solve this problem. What about a house wrecking party where the stressed out laborers that are working on the park could go out to the parking lot and have some fun drinking and busting up the remaining old structures? CV loved the idea because it provided the perfect cover to clear up a hair in the soup. Remember back when CV acquired all that land by writing into the contracts any outrageous demand the property owners had? CV had promised the Clausen family, in exchange for selling their land, they could keep their house on site for their daughters to live in. Why CV ever agreed to something so ridiculous remains to be seen, but now they had to do something about this house. Nobody was living in it by this time, but contractually Disney could not demolish it. What if, during this house wrecking party, things went a little off the rails and the house were to spontaneously catch fire in a freak accident? Insurance would compensate the Clausens, and Disney would be able to move ahead with their parking lot. Based on CV's past behavior, we know this sort of extra-legal behavior is right up his alley, but being such an established public face for Disneyland, he himself couldn't be directly involved in this level of shenanigans. So he tasked the bombers from Amarillo to make sure the job got done right. CV instructs them carefully. The land must be completely cleared. Like clockwork, a truck full of liquor arrives and the house wrecking party commences. On schedule, a house on the property mysteriously catches fire. A bomber phones CV with the news. A house on Disney's property is on fire. CV smiles. Quote, "Which one is it?" The bomber describes a white house, one that Disney already owned and could demolish at any time. CV says, quote, "That's the wrong one." Disneyland's first general manager and part-time arsonist arrives on site to personally see to it the right house is set ablaze. In the end, he decided they just set everything in the vicinity on fire. In the official report, Wood describes an act of God where orange tree piles caught fire and wind sent embers onto the nearby buildings. Nobody was the wiser, and yet another seemingly show-stopping impediment standing in Disneyland's way had been burned to the ground by the Magic Man. A few weeks weeks and a parking lot later, it's opening day at Disneyland. July 17, 1955 was supposed to be invitation only. This was the day Disneyland's opening was to be broadcasted, and Disney didn't want it swarmed with too many random visitors. But Walt's marketing through his TV show had worked such wonders, they were swarmed anyways. People brought ladders to scale the fences and get in for free, others had counterfeit invitations. Van France recounts an incident in his book, Window on Main Street, where he found his boss, C.V. Wood, standing outside the administration building looking quite out of sorts. "Van," he yelled, "there are people up in that castle, get them out." The access door hadn't been locked, and guests had climbed into the unfinished castle comprised of diagonal wooden supports and exposed nails. While opening day was far from perfect, the opening broadcast was viewed by 90 million viewers, over half of the American public. Here the nation witnessed the moment Walt's dream became real.
To all who come to this happy place, welcome.
While opening day, termed Black Sunday, would be panned terribly by critics, remembered for tales of women's high heels sinking into wet asphalt, the lack of water fountains, even gas leaks, which C.V. Wood took care of personally, the creators of Disneyland had accomplished the impossible. For C.V. Wood, it was a great success. He had met Walt's deadline, and clearly Disneyland had won the imagination of America. Walt, on the other hand, knew it was only the beginning. He wasn't interested in just making a splash like CV was. He wanted to earn the trust of the middle-class American family. Unlike one of his films where once it was sent to Technicolor, there was nothing more to be done, Disneyland would never be completed. Much to Roy and CV's dismay, Walt was already planning further, very expensive additions to Plus, his new form of entertainment. One early addition was a circus. Walt had always wanted a circus in his theme park. To tackle the anticipated drop-off in crowds in the lead up to the first Christmas, Walt insisted on adding a live circus to Disneyland. Naturally, CV wasn't having it. Disneyland was far from out of the woods, and a $600,000 circus with real-life performers and animals was the last thing that they needed. Roy brokered a compromise where his company, Walt Disney Productions, would lease the land for the circus from CV's company, Disneyland Inc., for $1. The circus would be a Walt Disney Productions expense, with Walt justifying the investment to Roy by explaining that they could reuse the infrastructure for a future film, which required one. The show opened Thanksgiving weekend, and it was clear right away this venture was a complete failure. It turns out when families spend their hard-earned money to go to Disneyland, they do so to spend time riding rides and exploring the park, not dedicating an hour and a half to watching a conventional circus that they could find much closer to home. Rather smug about the continually empty shows, Wood walks into the circus tent and suggests to Walt, sitting there among the empty seats, he make the show 45 minutes instead of 90. In that case, maybe people would bother to watch this show. A year of simmering animosity between Walt and CV had finally boiled over. Quote, "Damn you, this is my circus, get out of here," yells Walt as he points to the invisible line where Walt Disney Productions had leased the land from CV, inferring CV was not welcome here. "Get out," Walt screamed. CV would later recount it was the biggest fight they ever had. As 1955 came to a close, rumors were spreading Walt and Wood were not getting along. It wasn't long before Walt ordered Roy to fire CV Wood, who was never given cause. Officially, CV resigned, and he left his post February 1st, 1956. But that was not the end of the story. It's hard to overstate C.V. Wood's contributions to the very earliest days of Disneyland. In working on this documentary, I've often thought how rare someone with the disposition of Walt Disney is. Once in a generation for sure, probably even beyond that. Nobody other than Walt could have created Disneyland. Thing is, I have many of the same thoughts in regards to C.V. Wood. If it weren't for C.V. Wood, would Disneyland have even happened? Who would have gotten the land optioned? Who would have known all the right people to bring it to life? How would there have been enough money to make the project possible in the first place without all of CV's connections? How many CVs are there in the world who are such good salesmen they can convince executives at Pepsi, Swift, Kaiser, all these giant corporations to go all in on this product that Walt and CV spent months just figuring out how to describe to people? How do you explain something to people that doesn't exist and get them to invest enormous sums of money into it without any prior data to back up your claims. Like Walt, I think CV was a once-in-a-generation guy. Maybe together they developed a too many cooks in the kitchen type dynamic. They were both larger-than-life characters, but I think it was destiny. These two unstoppable forces crossed paths and did so just long enough to make Disneyland a reality. When CV was fired, I imagine he felt quite betrayed. He told Van France the prior year, quote, "Walt treats me like a son." And then the next thing he knows, boom, he's out. In truth, I sense that Walt always planned on axing CV after Disneyland opened. Walt's greatest accomplishment was making the Disney organization and keeping it together over many, many trials and tribulations. During the construction of Disneyland, CV created his own apparatus with the talent he brought in, people from Amarillo who were ultimately loyal to CV, not Walt. It's no wonder then, after he was fired, why many of his Amarillo buddies also ended up receiving the axe. Another theory about the source of tension between these two geniuses is that CV held an unusually public position within Disney. For a while, Disney was an organization where, while there were many individual talents inside the company doing great things, Walt was always the face and the name that was stamped on the final product. In the case of Disneyland, though, Walt was so stressed and stretched so thin, CV Wood carried much of the weight, giving tours of the construction to executives, welcoming dignitaries to the park once it opened. Shortly after opening day, Vice President Richard Nixon and his family visited Disneyland. Walt was sick, so who stood in for him? Featured in the photos published around the world, it was CV Wood. So finally, why was CV erased? How is someone this integral to the creation of the Disney parks, literally the first employee, omitted from Disney's company directory and official history of Disneyland? I suspect it's a combination of Walt didn't want him in the history and legal reasons. After CV left, not only did the attitude towards him change inside the company, as always happens when a boss conducts a purity test and everyone has to demonstrate their loyalty to the main guy, Walt, they also began to uncover some of the less than above board stuff CV did in order to meet Walt's deadline. They had lawyers go through all the legal documents that CV had written. They may have discovered there were kickbacks going on, where CV's sponsors were running large sums of cash under the table to the aircraft team to ensure things flew right, pun intended. There's been a lot of allegations along these lines over the years. This distaste towards CV over accusations of him being dishonest or duplicitous in his time as general manager, it's all hearsay. To me, though, it does sound like something that could be within CV's nature, and the bombers' nature by extension. These were kids of little privilege who grew up during the Great Depression. From a very young age, they developed this whatever it takes to not be poor philosophy, which suggests that they would be willing to bend the rules. And looking at the Disneyland parking lot story, we know that they bent the rules. CV was certainly doing quite well for himself. A month after Disneyland opened, CV was featured in the paper accepting the first Hudson Hornet V8 Hollywood off the assembly line in California. All that being said, I think a stronger explanation to why CV is omitted from the history is because Walt didn't want Wood in the history. Their relationship deteriorated, they weren't friends after Disneyland, and shortly after CV's firing, Walt sued him. CV went on to found his own firm, Marco Engineering, which would bring Walt's new entertainment concept of the theme park to the world. CV went on to build Six Flags Over Texas, Freedomland USA, and in the process of doing so, CV built himself as the master planner of Disneyland, overstating his importance, which offended Walt. Walt sued CV over this, and in the papers, a Disney spokesperson punched back at CV, diminishing his contribution to that of just a manager. We know that Wood did a lot more than oversee Disneyland's development. He was hands-on in its funding and its very existence. And CV would later demonstrate just how much he had to do with it all when he brought many of the sponsorships that he brought to Disneyland along with him to his other new themed entertainment ventures following his work at Disney. And while CV's theme park ventures following Disneyland never achieved the success or the patina of the original, really going to show how integral Walt himself is to the success of the Disney parks, CV eventually achieved a feat Walt died attempting. He built a city, several actually, but that's a story for another day. I'll see you next time. Address unknown.